There's something quietly unsettling about a man who walks alone, not merely physically, but existentially. He doesn't move with the hurried rhythm of the crowd. He isn't tethered by the invisible threads that pull most men: the need for approval, the chase for belonging, the quiet fear of being forgotten. Society doesn't know what to make of him. Is he lost or free? Dangerous or enlightened? For centuries, cultures across the world have mistrusted the solitary man, the monk, the wanderer, the philosopher, the bachelor. In myths, he is both sage and threat. In stories, he's either the hermit who renounces the world or the rebel who wants to remake it. But why? Why does the image of the single self-sufficient man provoke unease, even suspicion, in the collective mind of society? Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher who dared to dissect every hidden motive beneath morality, once wrote, "The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe." He understood that solitude can be both a danger and a gift, a crucible where weak men are broken, but strong men are reborn. The single man in Nietzsche's eyes isn't merely someone without a partner. He's someone who stands apart from the comforting illusions of the herd, and for that, he threatens the very structure of social order. Because a man who needs no validation cannot be controlled, and a man who refuses to conform forces others to confront their own quiet dependency. So this video will explore a question deeper than why are more men staying single. It's about why society fears them and what that fear reveals about power, conformity, and meaning itself. Across the next 6 insights, we'll explore the psychological and philosophical roots of this unease through Nietzsche's 20 dark truths about solitude, freedom, and the will to power. By the end, you may see that what society calls loneliness might actually be the beginning of self-mastery. There is a strange silence that comes when a man finally steps away from the noise of the tribe. At first, it feels like freedom. No more expectations, no more masks, no more pretending to believe in things he no longer believes. But then, something deeper settles in. The silence begins to speak back, and what it says is not always kind. Every man who has ever walked alone has felt this: the disorienting moment when solitude stops feeling like peace and starts feeling like exile. The tribe offers comfort, belonging, the illusion of meaning. To walk away from it is to face the terrifying question, who am I when no one is watching? Nietzsche believed that this question marks the beginning of real philosophy. The individual, he wrote, has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will be lonely often, and sometimes frightened, but no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. For Nietzsche, solitude was not retreat. It was rebellion. To separate oneself from the collective was not an act of isolation, but an act of purification. He saw society as a web of moral illusions. Herd morality, he called it, where people agreed on what was good or evil, not because it was true, but because it was safe. The tribe teaches you what to want. It rewards obedience and punishes difference. It calls comfort virtue and conformity kindness. The solitary man disrupts all of that. He doesn't play the game. He isn't motivated by approval, and he refuses to be defined by his usefulness to the group. In doing so, he becomes a mirror, exposing how much of society's morality is built not on truth, but on fear. Nietzsche's own life was a testament to this rebellion. He lived most of his adult years in isolation, wandering through the mountains of Switzerland and Italy, plagued by illness and solitude. His books sold poorly. His peers dismissed him. Yet he continued writing with a kind of sacred defiance, as if the very act of standing apart was his proof that he was alive. He believed that only in solitude could a man hear the faint whisper of his authentic self, the self that has not been tamed by expectation. And yet, that authenticity comes at a cost. When you no longer belong to the tribe, you lose the warmth of shared illusion. You see the machinery of society too clearly, the rituals, the politics, the desperate clinging to belief, and it becomes impossible to unsee. Nietzsche warned that this awareness can turn a man into what he called a free spirit. But the free spirit, he wrote, is a wounded one. He must suffer the loneliness of freedom, because freedom is not comfort, it's confrontation. You confront your smallness, you confront your fear, and you confront the possibility that there is no one coming to save you. Society fears the solitary man precisely because he has done what most people secretly long to do and are too afraid to attempt. He has stepped beyond the safety of belonging, and in doing so, he exposes the truth that most community is just shared dependency, a way of avoiding the burden of thinking for oneself. When a man withdraws from the tribe, he doesn't just leave a group, he threatens its stability, because if one man can live without the collective, others might start to question their own need for it. And so, society creates myths to keep him in line. The bachelor must be lonely, the outsider must be broken, the philosopher must be mad. It's a moral strategy of containment. But what if solitude isn't a symptom of isolation, but the birthplace of vision? What if the men who dare to walk alone, from Socrates to Thoreau, from Nietzsche to modern thinkers, are not broken, but whole in a way that society no longer understands? Nietzsche Sip's first dark truth is this: you cannot become yourself until you are willing to be misunderstood by everyone else. That is the price of solitude. That is the rebellion of the self. And though society may fear the solitary man, it secretly depends on him because it is always the one who stands apart, who reminds the herd what it means to be free. Have you ever noticed how quickly society turns admiration into resentment? How the same man who was once praised for his independence soon becomes labeled as arrogant, antisocial, or cold? That shift from fascination to hostility is not random. It is a psychological defense, a projection of weakness onto strength. And Nietzsche had a word for it: resentment. Resentment is more than jealousy. It is the quiet venom of the powerless, the way those who feel trapped by their own conformity turn their helplessness into moral superiority. When they cannot rise to meet the strong, they condemn the strong for standing too tall. Nietzsche saw this as the hidden engine of modern morality. The herd, he said, creates values not to celebrate virtue, but to tame vitality. They call humility good because they are too afraid to be great. They call obedience moral because they lack the courage to disobey. And when a man steps outside that moral order, when he refuses to play by their rules, they instinctively try to pull him back down. Think of how society talks about single men. When a man chooses solitude, he is rarely admired for his independence. He is pitied for his supposed loneliness. If he is content, he must be lying. If he is focused, he must be emotionally unavailable. If he doesn't crave what others crave, family, constant connection, external approval, he becomes a threat to the narrative that keeps everyone else comfortable. This is not just Nietzsche's theory, it's psychological reality. Carl Jung noted that what we reject in others is often a reflection of what we repress in ourselves. The fear and judgment society directs toward the solitary man may, in truth, be the echo of its own inner emptiness. The man who walks alone becomes a mirror, and mirrors are dangerous. They reveal what people work so hard to hide. Nietzsche observed this mechanism in religion, politics, even art. In On the Genealogy of Morality, he described how the slave revolt in morality turned natural strength into sin. Once, power was admired, the vitality of the warrior, the creator, the thinker, but as the weak multiplied, they redefined goodness itself. Weakness became virtue, strength became vice. The man who governs himself, who does not bow to collective judgment, must therefore be demonized, because if he is right, the entire moral structure collapses. This is why society mocks the man who values solitude, but praises the one who conforms. It's safer that way. The solitary man, by his very existence, reveals that it is possible to live without the tribe's validation, and that revelation is intolerable. Nietzsche wrote, "Those who are hated most in this world are those who tell the truth." The single, self-reliant man tells the truth not with words, but with presence. He shows that peace can exist without approval, that meaning can be built without applause. He doesn't need the world, and so the world needs to believe that he is incomplete. This mechanism repeats everywhere. In the office, the quiet man who refuses gossip is called aloof. In relationships, the one who sets boundaries is accused of being emotionally unavailable. In politics, the dissenter who once set chant the slogans of his side is labeled dangerous. It is easier to pathologize strength than to confront weakness. But Nietzsche challenges us to look deeper. He reminds us that resentment is not just a social weapon, it's an inner one. Every time we resent another's independence, we confess our own chains. Every time we envy the man who walks alone, we reveal how far we are from ourselves. The second dark truth, then, is this: what you condemn in others often reveals the power you have refused to claim within yourself. So when society fears the solitary man, it's not really him they fear. It's what he represents, a version of themselves unburdened by permission, approval, or conformity. He embodies a freedom that most have forgotten is even possible. That is why Nietzsche saw resentment as both tragedy and teacher. It shows us where we have betrayed our own potential, and it asks us, quietly, relentlessly, to stop projecting our weakness outward and begin transforming it inward. Because the moment we stop resenting the strong, we begin to become strong ourselves. If this reflection resonates with you, if you've ever felt the quiet loneliness of walking your own path, consider subscribing. We explore questions like this every week in search of the wisdom that helps us live truthfully, even when the world misunderstands us. At some point in every solitary man-sit's life, there comes a haunting realization. If no one is telling me what to do, what should I do? It sounds liberating at first, but in truth, this is where the way to freedom reveals itself. Because when all external structures dissolve, when no one defines your purpose, your morals, or your identity, you stand naked before the raw question, can I bear the responsibility of becoming my own lawgiver? Nietzsche believed that this confrontation with freedom is the defining test of the higher man. He called it the will to power, not the desire to dominate others, but the capacity to shape oneself. It is the creative force that compels a man to build meaning where none is given, to impose order on the chaos of existence through strength of will and vision. For Nietzsche, most people never reach this point. They prefer to obey, to find comfort in systems, ideologies, or authorities that relieve them of the burden of choice. They surrender their will to the collective's moral code and call it virtue. They follow routines and call it stability. But beneath this obedience lies a quiet resentment, the knowledge that they have never truly lived on their own terms. The solitary man, by contrast, no longer has that luxury. When he walks away from society SIP's expectations, he loses not only the tribe, but the ready-made scripts that once guided his behavior. He can no longer ask, "What will people think?" or "What should I do?" He must instead ask, "What do I value enough to build my life around?" That is a terrifying question, because it forces a man to face his own nothingness, the void left behind when borrowed meanings collapse. Nietzsche described this as the moment when one looks into the abyss and the abyss looks back, but he also insisted that this abyss is not the end. It is the beginning of creation. The will to power is born in that darkness. It's the inner engine that refuses to let despair have the final word. It says, "If life has no inherent meaning, then I will give it one." It transforms freedom from paralysis into authorship. But here lies the danger, and the reason society fears the man who embraces this will. A man who determines his own values can no longer be ruled by moral convenience. He becomes unpredictable, untamed, unbought. He no longer needs external approval because his compass is inward. He doesn't measure himself by comfort or conformity, but by the strength of his self-overcoming. Nietzsche's Übermensch, often mistranslated as Superman, represents this very state. He is not a tyrant or a conqueror. He is a creator. He lives as art. His life is a continuous act of value-making, sculpted by discipline and daring. As Nietzsche wrote, "The higher man is the meaning of the earth. Let your will say the higher man shall be the meaning of the earth." But this path is not for everyone. The same freedom that makes the self-determined man powerful also makes him frightening, because his existence exposes how fragile our social institutions really are. If meaning can be created, then moral authority is not absolute. It's optional. The herd depends on the illusion that morality is fixed, that good and evil are external laws. The solitary man breaks that spell by living as proof that life itself can be redefined. Modern psychology supports this insight. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, wrote that when man can no longer rely on meaning given by religion or society, he must create meaning through personal responsibility. Freedom without responsibility, Frankl warned, degenerates into chaos, but responsibility born of inner will, that is what gives existence dignity. The self-determined man doesn't seek permission. He acts from principle, not impulse. He channels his instincts into structure, his solitude into strength. But the price of this power is heavy. He must continuously fight the temptation to fall back into comfort, to let others think for him, to surrender the creative burden. Nietzsche sips third dark truth. Then, is this: freedom is not escape from control. It is the mastery of the self, and mastery demands continual creation. Every day, the solitary man must reforge his values in the fire of experience, refusing both despair and obedience. That's why Nietzsche once said, "Become who you are." It sounds simple, but it may be the hardest command ever given to man, because it requires courage, not just to live, but to create yourself anew every single day. Somewhere along the path of human history, love stopped being a mystery and became a promise that someone, somewhere, would complete us, that the ache of existence could be healed, not by truth or virtue, but by another human being. This promise, though beautiful, has quietly become one of the most powerful religions of the modern age. And like all religions, it demands faith, conformity, and sacrifice. Nietzsche saw this transformation coming. He argued that when traditional religion began to lose its grip on the modern mind, when God died, as he famously said, the human heart did not become freer. Instead, it went searching for a new altar, a new way to worship, to belong, to escape the unbearable solitude of existence. Romantic love became that altar. The modern world sanctified it, turned it into salvation. Films, songs, literature, all repeat the same gospel. Without love, you are incomplete. Without your person, life is somehow lesser, unfulfilled. It is the tribe's cleverest invention yet, the emotional tether that keeps even the seemingly independent man quietly obedient to social expectation. But Nietzsche wasn't against love itself. He was against illusion. He saw that most people don't seek love as communion, but as escape. They want love to spare them from the responsibility of selfhood. No one, he wrote, wants to be burdened with themselves, and so we seek someone to absorb that burden, to dissolve our uncertainty into the comforting unity of we. The problem, as Nietzsche and later Freud understood, is that this makes love transactional. It becomes a negotiation of needs, rather than a celebration of freedom. We turn our partners into symbols of safety, validation, or worth. And when they fail to provide that, we feel betrayed, as though they violated a sacred truth. But it was never truth, only expectation disguised as meaning. The solitary man threatens this illusion. By existing contentedly, outside the romantic ideal, he becomes living proof that fulfillment can exist without dependence. He reminds society that love is a choice, not a necessity, and that terrifies people who have staked their identity on being chosen. In Plato's Symposium, Aristophanes tells a myth about love's origin, that humans were once whole beings, split in two by the gods, condemned to wander the earth, searching for their other half. It's a poetic story, but Nietzsche would have laughed at it. To him, the highest man is not searching for his missing half. He is busy becoming whole on his own. Modern culture romanticizes codependence. It calls it devotion. It glorifies sacrifice without purpose, obsession without awareness, and loneliness as failure. But the truth is that love born out of fear of being alone is not love. It is dependency wearing perfume. This doesn't mean the solitary man rejects intimacy or affection. It means he refuses to worship them. He sees that love is meaningful only when it's freely given, not used as a shield against existential emptiness. He can love deeply because he does not need to. His love becomes an act of abundance, not desperation. Nietzsche's writings on Eros, the life force of desire, echo this. He believed that love, when purified of illusion, could be one of life's most creative powers, but only if it serves life, not replaces it. He warned that idealized love turns man into a servant of fantasy. True love, he suggested, should intensify existence, not distract from it. The solitary man understands this. He no longer worships romance. He respects it. He no longer seeks completion. He cultivates connection. He knows that to stand alone is not to reject love, but to make space for love that is real, unpossessive, undemanding, alive. The fourth dark truth, then, is this: what most people call love is often just fear in disguise, fear of facing themselves. And once you see that, you can no longer love as the herd loves. You can no longer believe that salvation lies in another's arms. Instead, love becomes something rarer, a shared solitude between two beings who have already made peace with their own. Nietzsche once wrote, "It is not a lack of love, but a lack of friendship that makes unhappy marriages." In other words, it's not love that imprisons us. It's the idea of love we've been taught to obey. And that idea that someone else must complete you is the quietest, most elegant form of control society has ever invented. Solitude at its best is a forge, a place where a man refines his soul away from the noise of the world. But every forge has its danger. Stay too long in the fire, and what was once transformation becomes destruction. Not every solitary man is free. Some, in rejecting the herd, fall into the deeper trap of meaninglessness. They confuse independence with detachment and strength with numbness. They stand apart, not out of conviction, but out of despair. Nietzsche knew this danger intimately. He spent his final years staring into the abyss of his own philosophy, the recognition that if God is dead and all values are human creations, then life itself risks becoming a void. Without a higher authority, what remains to guide us? What stops us from sinking into nihilism? The belief that nothing matters. He called this the great crisis of modernity, not the loss of faith, but the loss of direction. And nowhere is this crisis felt more acutely than in the heart of the isolated man. At first, solitude feels like liberation. No rules, no expectations, no false gods. But over time, the silence deepens and a darker question emerges. If I am free from everything, what am I free for? This is where strength turns to shadow. Without purpose, freedom becomes emptiness. Without meaning, independence becomes exile. The man who once rebelled against the tribe begins to see his solitude not as power, but as punishment. His independence curdles into bitterness. He starts to look at the world he left behind with contempt, as though his superiority could protect him from his own inner void. Nietzsche understood this transformation as the great test of the higher spirit. He wrote that when the old gods die, we must become worthy of being our own creators. But creation requires faith, not in religion, but in life itself. And this is precisely what nihilism destroys. It whispers, there is no point. And the moment a man believes that, his strength collapses into cynicism. Carl Jung, working a generation later, saw the same struggle within the psyche. He called it the shadow, the repressed, unacknowledged parts of the self that emerge when a man denies his vulnerability. Jung warned that the stronger the ego, the darker its shadow. When a man defines himself entirely through willpower or detachment, he risks being consumed by the very darkness he believes he has conquered. Jung's insight was that integration, not suppression, is the way forward. Solitude must be balanced with connection. Power must be tempered with humility. Otherwise, the solitary man becomes not a philosopher, but a ghost, drifting between pride and despair, unable to touch life with tenderness. Nietzsche's own writings oscillate between these extremes. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, his prophet descends from the mountain not to stay alone, but to share his insight, to bring light to the world of men. The danger of isolation, Nietzsche realized, is that it can become self-worship, a subtle form of nihilism where the self becomes the only God worth serving. But life, he reminds us, demands more than that. Life demands participation, creation, renewal. True solitude, then, is not rejection of the world, but preparation for re-engagement. It is the stillness before re-entry, the incubation of vision before expression. The higher man returns, not to be accepted, but to contribute. He walks alone, yes, but not forever. His path loops back into life, carrying something of the sacred silence he has earned. The fifth dark truth, then, is this: if solitude is not guided by purpose, it will collapse into nihilism. Strength without love becomes hardness. Freedom without creation becomes despair. And meaning cannot survive on rebellion alone. It must be continually rebuilt, like a temple made of fire and renewal. So the solitary man must be vigilant. He must guard against pride disguised as wisdom, and detachment disguised as peace. His task is not to flee the world, but to stand within it, rooted, grounded, uncorrupted. For as Jung said, the self is not only the center, but the whole. And Nietzsche, in his final lucid moments, whispered the same truth differently. To live is to suffer. To survive is to find some meaning in the suffering. In that sentence lies the bridge between despair and transcendence, between isolation and illumination. The shadow is not the end of the journey. It is the threshold to something greater. There's a certain kind of man who walks alone, not because he despises the world, but because he listens for what the world no longer hears. He lives in the quiet spaces. Most people rush past the early hours before sunrise, the long walks without music, the still evenings when thought turns inward. He is not running from others. He is returning to something older, deeper, to the voice of becoming that speaks only in silence. This man embodies what Nietzsche called der höhere Mensch, the higher man. Not a man of wealth or status, but of depth. He is the one who takes the pain of solitude and turns it into creation. He does not drown in the void. He builds in it. Nietzsche believed that the higher man emerges only through trial, through the slow, merciless confrontation with meaninglessness. Where the weak seek distraction, the higher man seeks transformation. He asks not, how do I escape suffering, but what can I build with it? Because loneliness, for Nietzsche, was not a wound, it was raw material. He once wrote, one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. That chaos, the confusion, the doubt, the ache of being misunderstood, is not an obstacle to greatness. It is its origin. The higher man does not seek to silence it. He learns to conduct it like an orchestra. From it, he draws art, insight, discipline, all the things that make him truly alive. The solitary man at this stage stops seeing himself as cursed. He understands that his distance from society grants him a vantage point others cannot see. He sees patterns in human behavior illusions in social morality, the quiet desperation behind people's smiles. And instead of resenting it, he uses it as fuel for wisdom. Psychologically, this is the point where solitude transforms from isolation into individuation, what Carl Jung described as the process of becoming one's true self. Individuation is not self-improvement, it's self-realization. It's when a man ceases to imitate and begins to embody, when he no longer asks, "Who should I be?" but "Who am I?" when all masks are gone. This kind of man becomes luminous in a way that frightens the world, not because he seeks attention, but because he no longer needs it. His stillness unsettles people. His silence provokes them. They sense that he knows something, not intellectually, but existentially, about what it means to stand free. But here's the paradox. The higher man does not despise humanity. He loves it in a higher, almost tragic way. He understands that people cling to illusions, not because they are foolish, but because they are fragile. He knows that not everyone can walk through the fire of solitude and emerge intact. And so, instead of condemning the world, he becomes a quiet guide within it. Think of Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, writing his meditations alone in his tent during war, speaking not to an audience, but to his soul. Or of Nietzsche himself, wandering the Alps, writing words that the world would not understand for decades. Or of Jung breaking away from Freud's orthodoxy to explore the unconscious and nearly losing his mind in the process. Each of them faced the same truth. Creation demands isolation. And yet, isolation is not the end goal. The higher man turns loneliness into a kind of spiritual gravity. He draws meaning from within and uses it to shape the world around him, not to dominate, but to illuminate. He builds, teaches, writes, composes, innovates, not for applause, but because expression is the natural consequence of inner wholeness. Nietzsche's sixth dark truth is this: loneliness, when endured consciously, becomes the birthplace of power, not the kind of power that controls others, but the quiet, radiant power of a man who has mastered himself. He is no longer at war with life. He collaborates with it. He no longer seeks freedom from the world. He brings freedom into the world. That is why Nietzsche called such men the bridges to the overmen, those who live as the living transition between what humanity has been and what it could yet become. The higher man does not belong anywhere, and yet everywhere he goes, he makes belonging possible. He walks alone, yes, but his solitude is no longer a wound. It is a wellspring of creation, of wisdom, of unshakable peace. So why does society fear single men? Because they remind the world of something it has forgotten, that freedom has a price, that truth often begins in silence, and that peace is not found in belonging, but in becoming. Throughout history, single men, philosophers, artists, mystics, have been misunderstood, even demonized. They are often painted as threats, too unpredictable, too detached, too disobedient. But what they really threaten is illusion, the illusion that comfort is the same as meaning, that compliance is the same as goodness. A man who stands alone cannot be manipulated. He cannot be bought by status or controlled by shame. And that makes him, in the eyes of a fragile society, dangerous. Nietzsche saw this with brutal clarity. He watched as the 19th century turned men into servants of mediocrity, obedient workers, docile believers, polite citizens. He warned that when individuality is crushed, greatness disappears. And so, he called upon the few, the misfits, the loners, the restless thinkers, to resist, to stand apart, not out of pride, but out of principle, to suffer isolation, not as punishment, but as preparation. He once wrote, "The higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly. That is the quiet truth of the solitary man. The more he grows, the less others understand him, and yet the more he quietly shapes the world." You see, the solitary man doesn't reject society because he hates people. He steps back because he loves truth more than comfort. He refuses to numb himself with noise. He refuses to build his worth on applause. And in that refusal, he becomes something modernity no longer knows how to define a free soul. A man who chooses the path of solitude is not running from love, but toward depth. He is not fleeing relationships, but illusions. He does not reject community. He redefines it, not as conformity, but as communion between whole beings. His life may look empty from the outside, but inside it is full, full of thought, creation, and clarity. Nietzsche's 20 Dark Truths were never meant to glorify loneliness. They were meant to purify it, to strip away its sentimentality and reveal its purpose. Loneliness is not the end of the journey, it is the forge, and the man who passes through it comes out tempered, sharp, discerning, deeply alive. So, if you ever find yourself walking alone, misunderstood, uninvited, unseen, remember this: solitude is not your enemy. It is your initiation. It is how the world quietly asks you to find your voice, your discipline, your truth. And when you do, when you emerge from that darkness, you'll no longer crave the world's acceptance. You'll simply act in alignment with what you've become. Your words will cut deeper. Your presence will steady others. Your existence will speak, even in silence. That is the destiny of the solitary man, not to escape the world, but to deepen it. Not to flee the human condition, but to stand within it, unbroken. Because in the end, the greatest danger is not that society fears single men, but that single men might start fearing themselves. And that, Nietzsche would say, is when the spirit dies, not when the body is alone, but when the soul forgets its power to stand free. So let this be your reminder. If you walk alone, walk awake. Walk knowing that you are part of a lineage of men who chose truth over comfort, becoming over belonging. And though the world may not understand it, it needs it desperately. Because every generation needs its solitary men, those who think, create, and question, until the rest of us remember what it means to be truly alive. If this journey resonated with you, subscribe, reflect, and share your thoughts below, not as followers, but as fellow travelers walking the long, quiet road toward what we could yet become.